A rare and bitter irony is unfolding in history. Alexander Lukashenko's iron fist has now crumbled, and the regime he has forcibly maintained for years is falling apart under pressure from both sides. These massive columns of people and cars you see are not fleeing from a catastrophic disaster. This is the image of the Kremlin's new desperation, reminiscent of the Soviet collapse in the early 1990s. Russia, one of the world's largest energy producers and a giant pumping oil and gas to every corner of the planet, cannot find fuel to run its own engines at home. Gasoline queues have now become routine across Russia. People from different regions are sharing location-tagged photos showing queues so long they can be seen from space. Drivers and vehicles line up in front of gas stations starting at 5 in the morning just to get 5 to 10 litres of gasoline. They inform each other which stations have a few litres of fuel left, but most of the time, when they get there, they encounter signs saying, "Gasoline is out." Confirmed reports from occupied Crimea and the Kuril region of Sakhalin document that many stations have either closed completely or are only dispensing fuel with coupons. This fire, which started in the frozen lands of the Far East and occupied Crimea, is now spreading like an uncontrollable wildfire and is about to knock on Moscow's door. The Kremlin started making moves in a panic. Russia is now forced to knock on its small neighbor's door to fill its own tank. Data leaked on October 7, 2025 and confirmed by international agencies slaps us in the face with this tragicomic reality. Gasoline shipments from Belarus to Russia have quadrupled in just 1 month. This was not a gesture of friendship or a commercial agreement. It was a declaration of desperation. For Russia is not wounded, it is drowning, and the hand it reaches out to breathe is that of Lukashenko, who until yesterday lived under its protection. To understand why Russia had to buy gasoline from Belarus, gasoline queues are not enough. We need to look at the data to see the chaos within the Kremlin. The map you see on the screen is a snapshot data visualization showing how the Russian Federation is paralyzed by a total systemic crisis. 56 of the country's 83 federal regions, more than 2/3, are currently in the grip of fuel shortages and logistical chaos at varying levels. This crisis was not a temporary supply problem or seasonal increase in demand, as claimed by the Kremlin's propaganda channels. This is a state of collapse on a national scale, documented by open-source data, regional reports, and hundreds of visual pieces of evidence leaked from the field. A disaster of this scale did not emerge overnight. It is a systemic gangrene woven over months by the convergence of two destructive forces: Ukraine's surgically precise strategic strikes and the Russian state's chronic incompetence. It all began with long-range, Ukrainian-made kamikaze drones, such as the Lyuty, skillfully exploiting gaps in Russia's air defense network to reach targets hundreds of kilometers deep. These attacks were not random. Each was directed at carefully selected targets to maximize damage. The sites hit were critical distillation units that convert crude oil into gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel, control centers managing the entire operation, and storage tanks. To be more explicit, these attacks aimed not only to start a fire, but to paralyze the entire production chain by destroying complex components dependent on Western technology, whose repair would take months, even years. Since the beginning of 2025, massive facilities such as Ryazan, Tuapse, Nizhnekamsk, Kirishi, and Kuibyshev have been targeted by these attacks. According to reports from the Institute for the Study of War, ISW, and analyses by Western intelligence sources, these coordinated attacks have disabled at least 15 to 20% of Russia's total gasoline production capacity. This may seem like a small number on paper, but for a country's fuel supply chain, which is built on delicate balances, it has had a seismic impact. Ukraine's strategic drone operation brought the war to the very heart of Putin's stronghold, St. Petersburg, destroying 40% of a processing unit at the Kirishi oil refinery, the lifeblood of the city, and all of northwestern Russia, with a single precision strike. This was not merely industrial damage, it was a breaking point for the Baltic Fleet's operations, the supply lines to Kaliningrad, and the logistical backbone feeding the St. Petersburg metropolis. Coming in the midst of a fuel crisis that affected 56 of Russia's 83 regions and brought the empire to a standstill, this blow deepened the existing chaos and brought panic to the streets of the North's largest city. Ultimately, it was not just a refinery unit that burned in Kirishi, it was the final instance of the collapse of Putin's "motherland is safe" narrative and Russia's ability to feed itself. The Kremlin initially ignored the problem, with local officials reporting small-scale fires and technical malfunctions, while state television claimed everything was under control. However, satellite images verified in real time by open-source intelligence analysts, data from NASA's firm's fire detection system, and videos leaked by local residents ruthlessly debunked the Kremlin's propaganda. The images showed facilities burning for weeks, collapsing structures, and toxic smoke clouds covering the sky. Amid this chaos, Belarus entered the equation. According to data verified by industry sources, Belarus exported a full 49,000 tons of gasoline and 33,000 tons of diesel fuel to its neighbor in September. These figures represent a veritable explosion compared to previous months. However, the shockwave created by these figures pales in comparison to Russia's massive consumption figures. Russia consumes over 3 million tons of gasoline in a normal month. In other words, the 49,000-ton rescue package from Belarus covers only 1.6% of the country's monthly needs. This is like offering a band-aid to a patient who is bleeding. While reserves in major cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg may last for a while, the crisis is spiraling out of control across the vast geography stretching from the east of the Ural Mountains to Siberia and from the southern agricultural regions to the Far East. The Kremlin initially found a solution in completely banning gasoline exports. This was an unprecedented panic move, meaning giving up foreign currency revenues that were vital for the war budget. But even this was not enough to stop the internal bleeding. Prices skyrocketed, a black market emerged, and eventually regional administrations were forced to resort to desperate measures reminiscent of the Soviet era, such as sales restrictions and price freezes. Tankers from Belarus were entering Russian territory, serving as the most tangible evidence of this major failure, this systematic collapse. But even this did not solve Russia's oil crisis. Another chapter in this total systemic collapse was written in flames and twisted metal on September 25, 2025, near Smolensk, the country's western gateway. That day, the last hope train, carrying millions of liters of gasoline to alleviate Moscow's fuel shortage, collided with a truck at a simple level crossing and turned into a giant fireball. This disaster was not just the loss of 12 tanker cars and their precious cargo, it was a shameful testament to an energy superpower's inability to perform even the most basic logistical functions in a time of crisis, to its crumbling infrastructure, and to its war machine's inability to even feed itself. The Russian state media's attempt to present the incident as a simple accident cannot hide the truth. In wartime, the lack of even the most basic safety measures on the Minsk-Smolensk-Moscow railway line, which is of such strategic importance, was a critical failure. This accident shut down the main railway line between Belarus and Russia for hours, halting not only fuel shipments but also all military and civilian supplies passing through that line. Moreover, this accident painfully demonstrated how fragile Russia's western logistics corridor is, and how a future accident or partisan sabotage could paralyze its entire frontline supply capacity. Putin's last hope had vanished on a broken level crossing, and what burned in Smolensk that night was not just a train, but the Kremlin's very propaganda that everything is under control. Europe's heavy sanctions are cutting off the economy's lifeline, while the fragility of the Druzhba pipeline is hanging energy security by a thread. Moscow, meanwhile, is draining the fuel from Belarus's veins to suppress its own crisis. This move ignites a deep fuel shortage in the country. People heading to gas stations wait helplessly in front of empty pumps. Even those with money in their pockets can barely find fuel. For those without money, life has already come to a standstill. The picture is the same in kitchens. Milk, bread, meat. They are still on the shelves, but not for everyone anymore. In this bleak landscape, where inflation is shredding wages and living standards are eroding day by day, the people are being swept into a deep wave of anger. For young people, anger is giving way to an escape mentality. They memorize border routes and wait for opportunities to seek refuge in Poland. The average Belarusian on the street no longer wants to see either Putin or Lukashenko. Some go even further. They take up arms and join the Ukrainian forces. Vladimir Putin watches the events unfold helplessly. In fact, this helplessness is not a new phenomenon for Putin. Since the start of the war in Ukraine, the Russian leader's control over Belarus has weakened. Recent events have deepened this weakness. The week of August 13th to 19th marked a turning point in Belarus's energy dependence. Ukrainian drones targeted the Druzhba pipeline, which transports oil from Russia to Europe. Successive attacks, particularly on the northern branch, caused serious damage to the pumping station in the Bryansk region. Infrared fire images recorded by NASA satellites revealed not only infrastructure damage, but also the severing of the main artery leading to the heart of Belarus's refineries. The critical importance of this pipeline was indisputable. The Mosir and Naftan refineries sourced nearly their entire daily crude oil requirement from this pipeline. Even a few kilometers of disruption on the pipeline halted the flow towards Europe. The first repercussions were seen in Hungary and Slovakia. As regional media outlets highlighted the supply shock, panic pricing began in energy markets. However, the harshest impact was felt directly in the Belarusian domestic market. It was officially confirmed that the flow had completely stopped on August 18th to 19th. This disruption shook not only international trade, but also the backbone of the Belarusian economy. Prices, which were already trending upward at the beginning of August, recorded an additional average increase of 8% within a few days. This sudden jump in fuel costs created a wide chain reaction, starting with the transportation and logistics sector and extending to food prices. Logistics channels, already constrained by the European Union's tightened sanctions in the summer of 2024, exacerbated this shock. Belarus's foreign trade arteries began to clog at multiple points simultaneously. The picture was no different on the political front. In his statements during the first days of the crisis, Lukashenko tried to convey the message that the situation is under control, as usual. However, the images on the ground quickly proved this rhetoric to be empty. Long queues forming in front of gas stations revived memories of ration card life during the Soviet era. People began to store every drop they could find. Fuel stocks in cans, bottles, and even plastic bottles began to appear in home garages. As fuel prices rose, so did food transportation costs, causing the prices of basic products such as meat, milk, and eggs to skyrocket in cities. As official distribution systems collapsed, the black market trade in fuel and basic foodstuffs rapidly spread. Faced with this situation, Lukashenko waited for a relief measure from Russia. Under normal circumstances, Minsk, Moscow's little brother, viewed its dependence on Russia for energy as a guarantee. However, the Kremlin could no longer afford to send fuel abroad when it was not enough for its own people. Thus, Belarus was confronted with an unfamiliar situation. Even Russian companies turned to Belarusian refineries to fill the gap in the domestic market. This meant that, far from helping others, Minsk began to consume its already limited resources even more. The result was a double blow economically. On the one hand, refineries were struggling to meet domestic demand, while on the other, Russia's appetite was suffocating Belarus. This situation was perceived by the public not only as an economic hardship, but also as a political rupture. For Belarusians, this meant that the Kremlin had turned its back on them at the most difficult moment. The strategic shock created by a few tens of thousands of tons of gasoline from Belarus is much greater than its volume. These shipments are not just a logistical emergency response, but also the most visible symptom of deepening cracks within Russia's domestic front that can no longer be concealed. The ripple effect of this crisis is hitting the Kremlin's most feared target directly: the daily life, patience, and tacit allegiance of ordinary Russian citizens. Putin's 20-year social contract with the Russian people has always been based on a simple equation. Hand over politics to me, and I will give you order, stability, and a predictable standard of living. The fuel crisis is tearing up this contract before the eyes of millions. That stability is now evaporating in miles-long queues at gas stations. That order is being destroyed by the anger of drivers fighting each other to get fuel, black marketeers demanding exorbitant prices per gallon, and farmers staring at empty shelves. The first and most devastating impact of this ripple effect has been on Russia's agricultural sector. The crisis erupted at the most critical time of the harvest season. From Krasnodar to Rostov, in the southern regions known as the country's breadbasket, farmers could no longer find diesel to run their tractors and harvesters. This is not just an agricultural crisis, but the beginning of a potential food security disaster. Wheat that cannot be harvested from the fields will be reflected in bread prices in the coming months, while vegetables and fruits that cannot be transported will cause market shelves in large cities to remain empty. This is the most concrete example of how logistical gridlock can turn into a wave of domestic scarcity and chaos. Second, the crisis has trapped the Kremlin in an impossible dilemma. Military analysts have begun asking the question currently being debated at the General Staff headquarters in Moscow: where will the scarce fuel go? to the massive diesel reserves needed to keep the tanks, armored vehicles and artillery units on the Ukrainian front moving, or to the gas stations in the cities to prevent civil panic and a potential social explosion. If fuel is directed to the army, chaos in cities will escalate, and Putin's authority will be directly questioned by his own people. If fuel is diverted to civilian consumption, this will severely limit the mobility of Russian troops on the front lines, turning them into static and vulnerable targets and presenting Ukraine with new opportunities for attack. Both options carry the potential for disaster. This demonstrates how sophisticated Ukraine's strategy is. They are not just striking a refinery, they are also forcing the Kremlin to make a terrible choice between its own people and its own army. This is a vivid lesson in how, in a modern war where military and civilian logistics are intertwined, the collapse of the home front can trigger the collapse of the front line. Tankers from Belarus are but a few drops of water on this massive fire, while the flames continue to consume both fields and trenches. This crisis is no longer just a matter of gasoline, it has become a matter of regime survival. This fuel crisis is more than a series of tactical setbacks. It is the clearest part of a larger picture that fundamentally shakes Russia's core strategic doctrines and international position. This convoy of shame, formed by fuel tankers from Belarus, lays bare how the myths the Kremlin has built are being dismantled one by one. This is a strategic stalemate. Every move the Kremlin makes turns into a trap that worsens the situation. First, this crisis has completely debunked the impregnable Fortress Russia doctrine, which forms the basis of Putin's regime. For years, Kremlin propaganda has perpetuated the myth that Russia's vast geography and layered air defense systems would protect the motherland from any external threat. It was assumed that the war would be fought only on Ukrainian soil, a distant operation that the Russian people would watch on television. Yet now, Ukrainian drones are penetrating the deepest parts of this fortress, severing the country's economic lifelines. The burning of a refinery triggers a domino effect. Production stops, gasoline shortages begin, agricultural activities are paralyzed, civil unrest increases, and ultimately, the state becomes unable to perform one of its most basic functions. This is a declaration that the war is no longer a special military operation, but has become a national survival issue that directly affects the lives of every Russian citizen, threatening their security and well-being. Putin's promise of security and stability to his people has been lost amid the ashes of burning refineries. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, this crisis has fundamentally reversed the power dynamics in Russia-Belarus relations. For decades, this relationship was based on an asymmetrical structure in which Moscow was the patron and Minsk was a loyal client state. Putin kept the Lukashenko regime afloat with cheap energy, loans and political support, expecting absolute loyalty in return. Lukashenko's political future depended entirely on the Kremlin's goodwill. Today, the roles have reversed. Now it is Moscow that is on its knees, begging for help. Lukashenko, with his limited surplus of gasoline, has become a prop keeping his giant neighbor's internal stability afloat. So, what will Lukashenko ask for in return for this help? A reduction in Russia's political pressure on Belarus, more economic privileges, or Moscow looking the other way while he opens his own secret channels with the West? Lukashenko is no longer Putin's lackey, but an actor with bargaining power. Russia is forced to sacrifice its absolute control in its own backyard in order to continue the war in Ukraine. This is a tectonic geopolitical shift that could have much more dangerous consequences for the Kremlin in the long run. Finally, the psychological devastation caused by this situation is enormous. The fact that a nation that once boasted of being the heir to the technological and industrial power of the Soviet Union is now unable to produce gasoline, a basic industrial product, is a deep wound to national pride. Russia has been reduced to a situation similar to that of third world countries, extracting crude oil but unable to process it. This situation erodes not only the morale of the people but also their trust in state institutions. Local administrators, governors, and even ministries, seeing that the central government cannot resolve the crisis, are trying to fend for themselves, creating chaos and fragmentation within the system. This is the ultimate goal of Ukraine's military strategy, to defeat Russia not only on the battlefield but also within itself, within its own economy, its own society, and its own psychology. Every fuel tanker coming from Belarus is like a monument on wheels to this psychological defeat. Ultimately, this thin gasoline pipeline stretching from Belarus to Russia is not a corridor of aid, but a highway of failure. It is an analysis not of solidarity between two allies, but of how an energy empire is crushed under its own weight, suffocated in the flames of its own arrogance. Ukraine has written a new equation for modern warfare. To defeat a superpower, you don't need to destroy its army, you just need to cut off its lifelines, silence its engines, and take away the most basic promises it makes to its people. What is happening in Russia today is much more than a fuel shortage. This is the collapse of a system, the weakening of a leader, and the beginning of an inevitable national decline. The Kremlin is trying to extinguish the fire it started with a handful of gasoline brought from its neighbor. But the strategic fire has now engulfed everything, and these small drops will not be enough to stop the approaching inferno. In the end, what goes around comes around. So, what are your thoughts on this matter? Please share your thoughts in the comments. To stay updated on new videos, please subscribe to our channel and don't forget to turn on notifications. Thank you for watching.